So I wanted to provide a review and overview over how to set up particles, emit them from a plane, and not just everywhere on the plane, but a very specific area on the plane. So how do we control that? And then also to drive some field turbulence across the particle systems that we emit, and equate the particle color to the velocity of the particle. And so how do we set some things like that up? Okay, so let's just go ahead and jump right in here. So I'm just going to drop down a polyplane, and I'm going to scale that up about to the size of the grid. And I'm just going to turn the grid off. Okay, so from here, over here, I just want to change my modeling tab to FX. Okay, and now we can access the particles and things like that. Okay, but before we do that, I want to visualize where the particles will be emitted from. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to open up the hypershade. So we can open up that by just coming up here and clicking the little shader ball, and that'll open up the hypershade. Now anything that is originally dropped into the scene just automatically has this Lambert one shader on it. We don't intend to make any other materials at this point, so I'm just going to just hook up the color file to the Lambert one. Okay, so I could right click and graph this, or I could come down here and graph the Lambert 1 and everything below, or the Lambert 1, everything below and above. There's nothing below it right now, but if there was, it would graph that, or everything above. So a lot of times I just click the double arrows just so I get everything. Okay, so at this point, we've got our Lambert 1 down here. Let's go ahead and come over here to our color, and we're just going to click the little checker box. This little menu will pop up, and we don't want to click PSD file. We just want to make sure that we click file. So let's click file, and now that is hooked up this little file 1 into our hypershade graph. And so file 1 is over here, and I'm just going to click the folder, and I just want to navigate to where that image is. So from here, what we can do is we can tell the particles that are being emitted to only emit into the black areas and not to emit into the white areas. So anyway, yeah, let's just go ahead and attach that up. And now we can't really see anything at this point. That's just because we don't have textures on, so we could come up here and click that, or we could just hit the number 6 on the keyboard, and you can see 6, or clicking that little icon will enable that. So 5 or 6. So if I just hit 5 on the keyboard, it does that, and 6 does that. Okay. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to set up a particle system to be emitted from this plane. And so to do that, we're just going to click on the plane. We're going to come up here to End Particles, because we are in our FX tab. So End Particles. And we're going to come down to Emit from Object. Okay, and we reviewed this several times, so I think everybody should pretty much understand what's going to happen when I play this. So when I play this, right, we have particles emitting from each of the vertice areas on our grid. So there's a few things we need to change. One, I'm going to come over here, I'm going to just click this little plus sign next to the P-plane 1 so I can see the emitter 1, I can see my end particle 1, and I can see my nucleus 1. Okay, so first off, we are in our emitter 1 tab, and I can see that this is set to Omni. So I just want to change that to surface. Now if I rewind to play, now it's being emitted from all over the plane, but things are still falling. Okay, so that is in our nucleus 1, so I could click it here, or I could come and click that tab, but say we click that there, it just kind of brings that tab to the front just by clicking it here. Okay, so what we need to do to stop these from falling is just turn gravity off. Okay, so now if I rewind and play, now gravity is off and it's no longer falling, but now they're doing something different and they're rising up in the air. So to fix that, we want to go back to our emitter 1, and if we look at these tabs, we have transform attributes, basic emitter attributes. We just want to come down to the one that says basic emission speed attributes. And we can see that there's a speed on there. So we just want to turn that to 0. And if we rewind and play that, now we have particles just being born onto the plane. Okay, that's great. I'm going to stop that. Okay. The next thing we want to do, so now we've got our particles being emitted and sticking to the plane, and that's great. Now we want those particles to be emitted only into these darker areas. Okay, so first off, I want more particles. So let's set our rates, particles per second. I'm going to add 3 more zeros in there. Enter. Okay. Now let's scroll all the way to the bottom. Okay, there's this little extra tabs attribute. We're not really going to mess with that. We just want to look at this texture emission attributes. All right, we've already talked about particle color, inheriting particle color, and setting up RGBPP for all of that. So we're not going to mess with that in this example, but we are going to mess with this texture rate. Okay, so we have this hello there file, and so I could click this little checker box. I could click file and click there and hook up this hello there again, and that'd be totally fine. That would be a way to mirror what is happening on the plane. I'm just going to break that connection. But since I already have that file in here, right, because we can see it on the plane, I don't need 2 versions of it. If you need to go that direction, that will work. But for me, I just want to go ahead and utilize this this file that we already have in here. Okay. And so as I'm looking at this, all right, we have our Lambert 1, and we're starting to get all this stuff kind of overlapping and things like that. And so we could try to organize this somewhat by hand and move this stuff around. But essentially, I just want the Lambert 1. I don't really need all this other stuff, so I'm just going to click on the Lambert 1 and regraph that by clicking the double arrows. Okay, that's great. So now I can see this hello there file. Okay, we are no longer on our emitter 1, so we just want to pull this over a little bit to where I can see emitter 1. I'm going to click on that, pull this back over, and so now I can see hello there, and I can see emitter 1, and I can see this texture rate. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to middle mouse, click and drag. So I'm clicking my middle mouse and holding it down, and I'm just dragging that over here. And you can see the little box pop up around the texture rate. And I'm just going to let that go. Let's try that one more time. There we go. All right, so you can see through this little arrow, like if I click that, you can see that that's mapped to the hello there. Okay, I'm just going to click this little button up here to dive back up. Okay. From here, I just want to make sure that I click these 2 boxes. So we just want to check those, the enable texture rate and emit from dark. So with those 2 things checked, if I rewind this and play this again, we'll see. Yeah, let me hide this plane. So I'm just going to click on P plane 1, and I'm just going to click H for hide. And now I can see that the particles are being emitted just from that area. Okay, that's great. Now, the next thing that we might want to look at is if I click this little button and rewind it, you can see my particles disappear. For this particular effect, I actually want these to start on with this many particles, right? And not to emit any more after that. So again, if I rewind, they disappear, and I want to start with something like this. Okay, let's stop that. So from here, what I would want to do is I want to click on the in particles, or I could also click it here, and I just want to come up here to in particles where we see that, and just come over to fields and solvers. See that? Let's click on that. Let's open that up, and let's come down to initial state and set for selected. And now if I click the little rewind button, we should see that. Now there is one thing, since we're going to do a simulation here, that I do want to make sure that we have. I'm going to come down here and click this little orange dude with the little gear all the way in the bottom right. And I just want to come down over here to the time slider, and I'm looking at the playback. Since we're doing particles and we're doing simulations and things like that, I just want to make sure that this 24 FPS is set to play every frame. So I'm just going to change that to play every frame, and I'm going to click save. Okay. So again, we are back to frame 1. But if I click play, you might not really be able to see it, but we're still emitting particles. And we can look at that by coming up here to display and come over to heads up display. We already have our poly count on, which is always good, but we can also do a particle count. So I'm going to check that little box, and so you can see our particles being back at frame 1, right? So we've set our initial state to this. But if I click this and play, you'll see these numbers are increasing. So we are still emitting particles into that. Even though you might not visually see it, we are still emitting particles. So again, if you just watch those little numbers, you can see that we're still emitting particles. Okay, I don't want that, so I'm just going to click rewind. And I'm going to come back over here and click on emitter 1. Okay, and now we've got all this set up, so I just want to go all the way back to the top. And looking at my rates, particles per second, I'm going to select all that, and I'm just going to hit 0. So now if I play, we are no longer increasing our particle count. Okay, that's perfect. So the next thing we might want to do is get these particles moving and get some colors to be associated with that movement. So let's set up our turbulence field or another field to control some of that. So let's click on our end particle 1. And again, if we come up here and we look at fields and solvers, just making sure that end particle 1 is already selected. Fields and solvers, if we come down to turbulence, or we could do any of these or a combination of these, but I'm just going to do turbulence. Okay. And I'm going to change the magnitude over here to 50. And so I'm not going to dive in too much. I know we've talked about this a little bit, but just think of magnitude as strength, attenuation for how far the effect reaches, so to speak, and then frequency, if you remember your science class, right, those little waves, right, that's frequency, and the higher the frequency, the closer those waves are together. Or another way that you could think of it is the higher this gets up, the more detail is going to be in there. Okay, so first off, I'm just going to go ahead and click play, and we're going to see what we get. All right, so we're getting some interesting stuff. We're getting movement and all that sort of stuff, so that's great. Rewind that. Now, I may not want all this to move at the same time, right? So if I click play, it all moves in unison at the same time. So what we might want to do is have it start moving over here and just kind of wipe across and start to create movement as it wipes across. So how we might do that is if we scroll all the way down here in our turbulence field, we'll find volume control attributes. And so if we click the little arrow next to that, we can see this little volume shape. So if I click on that little volume shape, we have all these different shapes. I'm just going to use a cube. And what this volume shape does is it basically says there is no turbulence outside of this box. So a second ago when we click play, right, everything started moving. Now if I click play, nothing's going to move. Let's move this little box over a section of particles, and let's rewind that and play that again. Now you can see just the particles that are inside that box move, right? Okay, or if we moved it over here, right, you can see just the particles that are inside of that box gain velocity. Okay, so let's rewind this and let's add an animation to this box to create like a wipe type of fill. Okay, so I'm just going to move it over here, and I'm going to scale it up. Something like that. Okay. And I'm going to set a keyframe. Now, the one thing I don't want to do, right, if I click S to set a keyframe, everything gets a keyframe, right? You see how everything turns red? I don't necessarily want that. I just want to keyframe at this point the movement. Because as I start to design this, I may want to affect the strength or the attenuation or the frequency or the interpolation and so forth. So really, I don't want everything keyed. I just want this translate key. So I'm going to right click on our X, right? So if we remember, we have 3 values. So this is X, right? So this is X. This is Y, so the up and down. And then this is Z, and that would be back and forth, right? So we just want to animate along our X. So I'm going to right click on that little box and it brings up this menu, and I'm going to click on set key. Okay, and then in the time slider I'm going to come all the way over here to frame 200, and I'm just going to pull that just over here to the other side, and then I'm going to right click and set key. Okay, and so now if I click rewind, we'll have this movement that goes across the particles. Okay, and at this point I'm not going to get into designing behavior and things like that, but feel free to jump in here and play with all this sort of stuff. The purpose of this video is just kind of review everything and show functionality, but feel free to get in here and play with design and change your magnitude and your attenuation, frequency, all this sort of stuff. Get in there and play with your phases and whatnot. Okay, so we need to do one last thing. And at this point, we're getting, we've emitted our particles in a very specific area. We've controlled how the turbulence plays and interacts with our particles by enabling this volume control and animating that. But I want to have my particles equal to the velocity of their movement. So how do we set that up? Well, let's come and let's click on end particle 1. Okay. And if we come over here to add dynamic attributes, okay, let's click that. Right now, our particles are colored as a group, okay. And so what I mean when I say that, if we were to select a little particle over here, well, it's going to be equal to this little particle over here, this little particle over there. They're all the same color. And so what we want to do first off is create a way for each particle to have their own individual color. And that's what this add dynamic attribute does. So if we come over here and click color, we get this little menu, and we can check this box for add per particle attribute. And so before I click that, I'm going to come over here, I'm going to open up the per particle array attributes so that you can see what we have. After I click this, you will see an RGBPP, and so that stands for RGB is color and PP stands for per particle. So color per particle. And so you will see that pop up in here after I click this box. So right now it's not in here, but if I click this box and then add attribute, so I check the add per particle attribute, right? We're going to add that attribute, and there we can see RGBPP. Okay, so now each particle can have its own color. What we want to do is have our color equal to our velocity. So as our particles start to move, the color will be equal to that vector, right? So our movements occur in X, Y, and Z, right? There's 3 values, and our colors are RGB, so red, green, and blue. Also 3 values. Okay, so anyways, let's go ahead and set this up. So RGBPP. So I'm going to right-click on this little box, and we get this menu. So creation expression, think of that as how particles are born, okay? We want this to occur as our particles run. So we have these 2 options, runtime after, or runtime expression before dynamics, or runtime expressions after dynamics. Since we're doing turbulence across these, let's go ahead and utilize the runtime expression after dynamics. So I'm going to click that little box, okay? And we get this little menu. So this is our expression editor. And so it's a very simple expression that we're going to use. We're just going to type in RGB. So RGB is lowercase, and then uppercase PP, space equals space. We're just going to type velocity. And velocity is all lowercase, and then we need to do a semicolon. So you want to use it just like that. So RGB lowercase, PP uppercase, and then space equals space, and then velocity is all lowercase, and then again a semicolon. And once we have this expression in here, we're just going to click create. And now we're going to click close. So now if I click rewind, everything turned black. Well, that's because there's no velocity, right? So our velocity is 0, 0, 0. And that means our red value is 0, our green value is 0, and our blue value is 0, which is black. Okay, so 1, 1, 1, so red 1, green 1, blue 1 would be white. Okay, but as this gains velocity, we will gain colors into our particles. So let's go ahead and play this animation and see what we get. Okay, so you can see as our particles start to move, we start to get different values. Now, one neat thing that you can do with this, if you want to look at the actual values of this, well, if we click on our particles, if you guys remember with our polygon geometry, for example, if we click on it and then we right-click and hold right, we get faces, edges, vertices, and so forth. Well, we also have a component element to our particles, right? We have our object mode, just like we would if it was a cube. But we also have our particles, so our components for, polygon cube, again, is faces, edges, vertices, and so forth. Right? So object would be the whole group, and particles would be individual particles. So if I click on that, okay. Well, I remember in here, that was like a green value. So I'm just going to click on one of these little particles. Okay, so I just selected that little particle right there. And if I come up to Windows and I come down to General Editors, and if I come over to Component Editor, okay, well, we can look at the components, right? And so the component that we're looking at is particles, right? So let's go ahead and click Particles. And in here you can see, let me stretch this out, our position X, our position Y, and our position Z. And then we can see the velocity, right? So how much velocity did it gain in X, Y, and Z? So if we look at this, okay, position or our velocity X, that is negative 0.852. Well, our red is negative 0.852. And Y, our velocity Y is 1.789. And our velocity green is 1.789. And our velocity Z, negative 0.470, and our blue, same number, right? So that's just a look at how that's working, right? So, and that's how we're deriving colors, right? So that little expression that we wrote, the RGBPP equals velocity, well, we basically told these numbers to become these numbers. So we essentially took this velocity data right here, velocity X through Z, and we converted that into color data here. And so this component editor is a way to look under the hood to see kind of mathematically or how things are being hooked up numerically. Is also another good way to say that. Okay, so again, if we click another particle, we'll see, we got different velocities, and again, our colors are equal to that. So as we click around, we'll get different velocity and different color data. Okay, now I do want to point out one other thing. You can see that our velocity, right, has negative. It can have negative values in here, right? Or it can have positive. So if all of these are negative, right, the color is also going to all be negative, which is going to put it below 0, and that means it's going to be black. Okay, so I'm just going to right click and go to object mode. So you can see there are particles in here that have black colors and things like that. So there's things that we could do. We could normalize that. We could create absolute values and things like that. I don't want to get too heavy into expressions, but just kind of point out that door for you. So if you want to play around with some of that, you can get some of that working for you. But at this point, I'm just going to rewind that and play again, and we'll take a quick look at that. And yeah, so again, we've reviewed how to set up particles, emit them from a plane, and then more specifically how to emit them from a very specific area on the plane based on the texture that we were using, right? So black we can emit from, and white no particles are emitted from. And then we looked at how to set up a turbulence field, right? And there's other fields that you can play with, right? Like vortex or whatever. But we looked at a turbulence field, and we set that up for our particles. But then we also looked at how to control through volume controls where and how our turbulence is being emitted, so we can gain a little more control over that. And then lastly, we just looked at how to create a per particle color attribute, and how to have that through an expression, the color equal the velocity. So as we gain movement, we also gain color. So anyways, this has been a quick review, and I hope this has been helpful.